Welcome to the Surviving Trauma Stories of Hope podcast. In this week's episode, I'm excited to welcome the all-inspiring Dr. Reshie Joseph from his practice in Singapore. Dr. Reshie started a professional career as a doctor, having obtained a medical degree from the University of Sheffield in the UK. He had a great future ahead until unresolved childhood trauma caught up with him. To cut a long story, it led to a 9-year descent that ended with homelessness, sleeping in a bus shelter, and hopelessly addicted to heroin and crack cocaine. He has been in recovery since 2011. He has since left medical practice, fully retrained as a clinical psychologist, and now practice exclusively as a psychological professional specializing in treating PTSD, complex psychological trauma, addictions, and other disorders of extreme stress not otherwise specified. In his newly released Amazon bestseller, A Beginner's Guide to Trauma, Dr. Reshie weaves the neuroscience with stories of his actual patients to back up every point he makes. He also shares his recovery journey in the book. This episode discusses Dr. Reshie's recovery journey, attachment styles, Big Pharma and the opiate pandemic, his Amazon bestseller, and much more. It has been my pleasure to have Dr. Reshie join me, and I know, my listeners, that you will enjoy this episode. Thank you to everyone for joining me on this journey. Comment on the posts on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn, and let me know what you think of this episode. Also head to Amazon.com or takealot.com and get your copy of my book, Ray of Light. And please leave me a rating and review. It would mean the world to me. Also, please check out my website and download your free journal prompt and relaxing meditation on the resources page. As always, stay tuned and keep listening. Welcome, Dr. Reshie, to the Surviving Trauma Stories of Hope podcast. How are you doing?
Hello to you, Marlene. Thank you very much for having me on your podcast. It's a delight to be here, and I'm looking forward to chatting with you.
I'm also looking forward to our conversation. You are such an accomplished doctor and a specialist in the field of neuroscience and mental health. So those are topics that are very close to my heart as a survivor myself. And so it's exciting to have this conversation with you. And I'm sure that the listeners will take away much needed advice from this conversation. So let's start by saying that you work in the field of psychology with patients and you focus mainly on the treatment of trauma patients, correct?
Yeah.
So as a survivor, for me, like I say, it's just, I'm so grateful for that work that you do because I can understand sort of firsthand how much that helps and contributes to healing after a traumatic experience.
Yeah.
Now, you've set out as a doctor in your career, but you've had your own personal experiences that were traumatic in your life. And if I understand correctly, this was triggered in your life by unhealed childhood trauma that caught up with you. Do you want to share with me and the listeners just what unhealed trauma that was and how that impacted your life?
Sure. And before I do that, I want to say, thank you for that suspiciously generous introduction that you gave me there. It was very
suspiciously.
The brown paper
these are facts.
The brown paper envelopes are stuffed behind the sofa, so no, just kidding. It's my English.
We cannot promote corruption on my podcast.
Yeah, no,
Dr. Reshie.
It's my very juvenile boarding school humor that I've never quite managed to leave behind me. But no, thank you for what was a very kind and generous introduction. So yes, going back to my childhood, I think it would be wrong to say to begin with that, it was perfect or it was, there wasn't anything wrong with it. I think looking back at it now, the warning signs were very clearly there. Right? The warning signs were very, very, very clear. It's just that nobody picked up on them. not much was known about this subject at the time. This is before Francine Shapiro. This is before Judith Herman. This is before, I think, Alice Miller had just published The Drama of the Gifted Child. So,
Yeah, that was sort of the mid 60s, if I'm not mistaken.
it was, yeah. And, I was
Yeah.
born in the early 70s, and we were a very long way away from the ACE study, which was the seminal moment, I think, in traumatology, as well as Stephen Porges' book on the polyvagal theory. So there was no means with which to understand this. Just oddly behaved boy, I think, was how I would have been thought of. And what actually happened was I grew up in a situation where, very unusually, I did not form a single secure attachment to an adult. And I think I need to explain attachment carefully, because people very often get attachment confused with love. They're not the same thing. One is about survival, and the other is not. So the first time we see attachment in nature is with birds. Before that, there are no attachment behaviors. You don't see them in fish. They lay their eggs and they swim away. You don't see them in frogs. You don't see them in reptiles. You don't see them in any section of the animal kingdom. They lay their eggs, the young fend for themselves. It's only with the advent of birds that the parents stay with the egg until it hatches, or the eggs. And when the baby chicks cry, that's when they get fed. And if they don't cry, they don't get fed. And as we move further and further up the evolutionary chain, attachment behaviors become more and more complex as organisms become more and more complex. And of course, eventually you reach us, the most complex organism of all. I mean, just by way of comparison, a newborn cow can run on the first day of its life, can get on its feet and run on the first day of its life. A newborn antelope can get on its feet and run, or zebra. A newborn baby can't even lift its own head on the first day of its life. So nature has given us this ingenious mechanism that allows us to form these very, very powerful bonds to people.
Absolutely.
That will ensure that those people will provide us with the shelter, the food, the water, protection from the predators, and so on and so forth. And it's no accident that nature uses the most powerful brain chemical that we have to do this. I am, of course, referencing the work of the great Estonian neuroscientist Jaak Panksepp. And I won't go down a rabbit hole, because if you let me, I will. So suffice it to say, he discovered that the chemical that was responsible for attachment was actually opioids, and that the whole reason why we had an opioid system in the first place was that it allowed mothers and children to bond to each other. And in that moment of birth, when a mother sees a child for the first time, or the child sees the mother for the first time, massive amounts of endorphins, which is a combination of two words, endogenous morphine. Endogenous simply means produced within the body. Exogenous is something that's introduced from outside the body. And, well, morphine is, we all know what that is. So the body floods the brain with endorphins, and that binds the mother to the baby, right? And that process goes all the way through childhood, which is why you see individuals raised. It doesn't need to be a parent. It could be an uncle. It can be, someone who's not even related to you, but someone who provides you with the key components that form a secure attachment would mean that you grow up without attachment trauma. I didn't have that. There was no adult in my environment, in my world, to whom I felt safe enough or that I felt close enough to, or that I formed a nurturing bond with. That never happened. And so I grew up never having formed a true attachment to anyone. And so what you get with that is, I describe it like this, when you try to get close to someone, it's like there's a trapdoor in front of them. And every time you get close to them, the trapdoor springs and you fall through it. There's this thing. So it prevents you from ever really getting close to people. And that's really what attachment trauma is. It's the inability to form genuine, emotionally intimate connections with other human beings. And that in times of distress, human beings turn towards each other for comfort. You see people hug each other, you see people, cuddle each other, or you see people, comfort each other. That is completely alien to me.
Mm-hmm.
The first time my wife many years ago reached out, to give me a hug, I went like this.
Right.
Yeah. And even till this day, I don't want to be hugged. I don't want to
Mm-hmm.
be comforted.
Don't touch me.
I just don't. I mean, I am getting better.
So how did you cope, Dr. Reshie? I mean, how did you cope, or was this just a natural way of being for you?
Well, I coped, but I don't know if I'd call it natural, but I substituted it with books. I was quite a brainy boy, a bit of a nerd, and spent inordinate amounts of time in the library and lost myself in the stories of George Orwell and Dostoevsky and Solzhenitsyn and Tolstoy, and this became my world in much the same way that the gamers are doing it, except theirs are much more powerful. And so there I was, an adult, a doctor who had no idea that there was such a thing as attachment and that it was the fundamental basis to all human survival. Because if we didn't have attachment, there'd be no reason for a mother to feed a baby. Attachment is what drives that mother. Look at a mother bird. The eagle can be swooping down on it, right? And the mother bird will stand its ground and it will open its wings and it will cover the chicks. It knows it doesn't stand a chance against that big thing coming out of the sky, but it will not move, right? That's the power of attachment. And when you have a relationship with somebody like that, when you have that in your life, it communicates certain things to you. It communicates to you that you are valuable, because you don't protect something in that way from a predator if it's not valuable.
Yeah.
Right? You learn that you're valuable.
Right.
You learn that you have a part to play within this system, because
That's right.
if you didn't, you'd be chucked out.
And you have worth.
And that you have a sense of worth. Exactly. Right. So if I can't get a sense of worth from my relationships, well, I'll get it from my brain, so I'll go to medical school and become a doctor.
Makes sense.
I'll get my worth that way.
Right. It's a healthy coping mechanism, becoming a doctor.
Yeah. But what really undid me was the first true attachment that I had was with a young boy, and he was dying of a rare cancer. And I remember I spent a lot of time with him. I was still a medical student at the time, and so I had time to spare. And I would spend hours sitting by his bedside, and we would talk about, there's a British comic called 2000 AD, and there's a character in it called Slane, and we would talk about Slane and his exploits for hours. And, he was a great lover of the work of PG Woodhouses, and so was I. And we would make up plays together where, one day I'd be Jeeves and he'd be Bertie Wooster, and then the next day I'd be Bertie Wooster and he'd be Jeeves. We did all these things. Now that was a secure attachment. You're important enough for me to spend this time with you to do this thing. That was the first
Yeah.
secure attachment that I had.
Yeah.
Sadly, that attachment was ripped away from me when
Yes.
the boy died. And that is when the wheels came off, because I was completely unprepared for the pain that followed that.
Yes. That must have been so devastating, Dr. Reshie.
I mean, it's a good candidate for the most devastating experience of my life. Till this day, I say with shame that on the day that he died, and I knew he was dying, and I knew he was asking for me, and I couldn't bear to go to his bedside. So I made up some excuse that I was needed at another end of the hospital because I could not bear to sit and hold the hand of this dying boy, to my eternal shame. But I now know why, because it was letting go of something that had become very, very precious to me. And the question is, what was it that was precious? It's not the boy. It's not the comics. It's not none of that. It was the attachment. It was a real human connection for the first time. No trapdoors, no nothing, but an opioid reinforced attachment that got severed. And when that got severed, my brain went into free fall because it didn't know what to do. And sitting by his bedside, I talk about this in the book, so I don't want to give too much away. You're on an oncology ward, there's diacetyl morphine absolutely everywhere. And something just made me draw up a syringe of diacetyl morphine. And, I just thought, well, I just can't bear being in this state any longer. So, I'm just going to take this and see what it does. And the wonderful thing about opioids is that people think that addicts take it to get high. They don't. Opioids do not represent a high. What they represent is the absence of emotions,
They suppress.
right? They take away, they take away all your feelings. So when that stuff hit my veins, suddenly all the emotions I was feeling and had not developed the mechanisms and the skills to deal with, suddenly all of them were taken away from me.
Wow.
And so suddenly I had a mechanism with which to deal with these pesky things called emotions. And that was the start. I had found a solution, and addiction was the solution. It was the solution to that pain that I felt when that boy was ripped from me.
Yes.
It was the pain that I began to recognize of intense loneliness, living in an emotional desert almost, never really getting close to anybody.
Yes.
I looked at all the relationships that I'd had with my girlfriends through university. I never ever told any of them the real truth about myself. None of them knew me, really, always kept myself very, very protected. And I had to start asking myself why that was. And
right, because you're presenting a different version of yourself to, the people who you interact with
I'm present
while guarding the real you.
exactly. I became very good at becoming all things to all men, right? I could don the mask of the doctor and play the doctor. I could don the mask of the caring boyfriend and be that person. And, but you and I both know that that's not authentic. It's doomed to fail. it is doomed to fail.
Very
Yeah, it's
unsustainable.
not sustainable. How long can you sustain that for? Well, I don't know how long people can sustain it for, but what I do know is that they can't sustain it forever. And of course, relationships start to fail. And so the addictions get worse to cope with the pain, and the cycle just goes in that way. And it takes on a life of its own. And it just goes into ever decreasing circles until it no longer becomes about people.
Mm-hmm.
It just becomes about the drug. And I remember a friend of mine, sadly, he passed away from an overdose. I remember saying to him, because we all had girlfriends, and
Mm-hmm.
it was always better to be in a team, kind of thing. And we always asked him, why he didn't think of getting himself a girlfriend. He said, "What do I need a girlfriend for? I've got my best friend right here holding up a syringe." He
Wow.
says, "That's the only friend I
Wow.
need." And it's interesting to note that the professor I quoted earlier, Yak Pangsep, in the very last paper he wrote, he died a few years ago, very sadly. But in the very final paper that he wrote, there's a quote in it that is so arresting that once you've heard it, you'll never forget it. And the quote is this: "In newborn rhesus macaques, morphine simulates the presence of a mother."
Mm-hmm.
I'll repeat that. In newborn rhesus macaques, morphine simulates the presence of a mother.
Wow.
If you take a newborn monkey or a newborn rhesus macaque and you give it morphine, it doesn't want its mother. It doesn't cry for its mother. And a baby monkey that doesn't cry for its mother doesn't get fed. Simple as that. And a baby monkey that doesn't get fed eventually dies.
It perishes.
It perishes, yeah. So this is how important the attachment circuitry in the brain is to our survival.
Yeah.
We're social animals, and our ability to bond to each other, and to um, be part of a winning tribe,
Right.
for want of a better
Right.
phrase, that isn't just a nice thing to have. And we see examples of this. If you look, you don't have to look very far. Go to any football game, go to any rugby game, go
Mm-hmm.
to any, there's sports being played all over the world, right? Why do people attend them in their thousands, wearing the jerseys and cheering their teams on? And because it gives them, it's a sense of attachment. It attaches them to each other, but there is also a wider attachment, and a societal type of attachment.
Yeah.
It gives them a sense of purpose, gives them a sense of meaning, which is a different topic which I deal with later. But
And belonging.
yeah, if you went to a football match and you sat in, say it was Chelsea versus Manchester United, and you sat in the Chelsea stands with the hardcore fans, right? And you weren't a fan of either team, I guarantee you that by the end of the match, you'll be cheering for Chelsea. Guarantee it.
I want I'm one of those those people. when when my team loses, I take off the jersey and I say, "Give me the jersey of the other team." And so people get very upset and they say, "You're not allowed to do that. You cannot change. You have to stick with your
Yeah,
team, and you must, even if they lose, you must walk out and
yeah,
wear this very
yeah,
proudly." And so, I've stopped going to any of
yeah,
these matches because apparently I'm an
yeah,
embarrassment to the
yeah,
rest of the gang. But
yeah.
but I wanted to ask Dr. Reshie, so at what point did you realize this was a serious problem that really needed to be addressed? And how did you go about reaching that point of sobriety?
Yeah, sobriety. I mean, it became fairly apparent to me pretty quickly. I mean, for one thing, my wife of a few years divorced me very, very sharply. That was the first massive warning sign. And, I began to rack up, misdemeanors and sort of
Mm.
appear in front of judges and courts and get into trouble with police and all the sorts of things. So it didn't take me long to realize I can't fool myself any longer by saying I can give up anytime I want. No, I can't. That's that, right? So if I want to give up, I've got to, find a treatment center or go and ask for some help and, go to a treatment center or whatever. But
Yeah.
with attachment trauma, you don't turn towards people, you turn away from them. So I never went to anyone and said, please help me, I'm suffering, or please help me, I'm in trouble. And I know that had I done that with either of my parents or siblings or any member of my family, if I had gone to them and said, I'm in real trouble, I need help, I need to go to a rehab, I need to get clean, this is the situation that I'm in,
Yeah.
I know for a fact that none of them would have judged me, would have berated me, would have castigated me, that every single one of them would have put their hands into their own pockets, would have banded together and said, we'll get you the help that you need. So it was not like the help wasn't there. I know for a fact, had I gone to either of my parents, they would have moved heaven and earth to get me the help I needed. But it was the inability to go to them and say, I'm in real trouble. Can you help me? And if you can't
Mhm.
do that, you are in a really dangerous place, because here you are in an addiction that's killing you and you can't ask for help.
So, how did that come about for you? Because you have been clean and you've been in recovery for 12 years, which I want to congratulate you on.
Yeah, thank you.
How did you manage to enter recovery and stay clean for 12 years?
Well, it's a very strange thing. There was one evening where I had taken a particularly brutal beating of a gang of West Indian or Jamaican thugs. And this was back when Soho was still very, very seedy and had all the girly bars and the strip bars, and all of that. And I remember an older prostitute was looking at me through her window, and then she came out into the street and sort of picked me up by the shoulder and walked me into her house. And she took off all my clothes and she dressed my wounds. She put me in her bathtub and I could tell she was a nurse. I've worked with enough nurses to know what a nurse looks like. I could see from the way that she was bathing my wounds, the way she was treating my wounds, and plastering them, covering them, so on and so forth. I
Hmm.
could see that she had, at some point in her life, trained as a nurse, and she did this for almost 3 hours, and not a single word passed between us. Not a single word. Never told me her name. Never told me why she was doing it. She just did that. And 3 hours later, when the process was over and my boots were back on my feet, she opened the door and just pushed me out. And that single act of kindness sparked the change that is now the recovery I enjoy. That is my belief, that it was an act of kindness from a complete stranger that brought me into recovery and has kept me off street drugs and alcohol for over a decade. That all of that can be traced back to a single act of kindness
Wow.
from a prostitute and I don't even know the name of this woman. And every year on the day, I think of her and where she is and what happened to her. And if I had one wish, it would be to meet her and to hug her and to tell her how much of a difference she made in my life. But yes, it was that single act of kindness that flipped a switch, and suddenly I was a different person. I mean, not as simple as that. It's a long road ahead, but suddenly the platform was laid for me to start learning how to build tentative attachments,
That's remarkable.
slowly building up towards it, and eventually going into therapy and learning what real attachments feel like, and I'm now married, and
Congratulations.
even now, yeah, I mean, I've been married, we've been together for 10 years now, but even now, if I'm terrified of something, it takes me 3 days to tell my wife, like if I almost got killed
Yeah.
surfing, it takes me 3 days to tell her that, because
But isn't that just the thing, Dr. Reshie, that even though we do the work, and you've certainly put in the work, and you're in recovery of 12 years, the parts of us that we've recovered from, they all still exist within us, and we know what they feel
yeah,
like, we know what they
oh
look
yeah,
like, we have the awareness that they
oh yeah,
exist, but we choose to make different decisions and different
oh yeah,
choices because we know what it
yeah,
looks like. If we
yeah.
don't,
Well, if I
yeah,
could borrow from Carl Gustav Jung, who said that if we do not make our unconscious mind conscious to ourselves, it will direct our lives and we will call it fate. Right? So the
yeah,
whole process is
yes,
really
so
about
true.
making what was hitherto unconscious to us, forces that were unconscious to us, to make it conscious to ourselves. This is what drives this. This is what drives that. This is what drives me to do this. It's bringing the unconscious mind into the realm of consciousness. Because if you don't do that, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. I couldn't think of a better way of saying
And
it.
it's like we say, yes, I mean, it will run your life if you let it.
Yeah, it will. And
So
yeah,
yeah. So, Dr. Reshi, you've recently written your book, and there are, I mean, we've spoken about attachment and attachment trauma, and thank you for so generously
yeah,
sharing your understanding and your experience with
yeah.
us. But I know that in your book, some of the other themes that you cover relates more to the opiate epidemic that we face.
Yeah,
And we know
yeah,
that in society and throughout the world, there is this epidemic that plagues many family members, and
yeah,
they don't have the happy ending as you have. So there are different views of the different structures in society of
yeah,
who and
yeah.
what fuels the opiate epidemic. But what do you think the pharmaceutical companies' contribution is to the opiate epidemic, if any?
Well, I mean, let's start on a smaller scale and then expand it, to the scale that we're at now. Okay.
Yes,
There were
thank you.
23 doctors on oncology ward along with me. I mean, there was diacetyl morphine absolutely everywhere. Huge jars of it, this size, massive jars of it, just absolutely everywhere, right? Now, if it was a question of availability, then all 23 of us should have been addicts. But only one of us became an addict, and that was me. The other 22 didn't. And there's a clue to that.
Yeah.
I remember walking past a room once and looking in it and seeing several of my colleagues huddled together, some of the girls were hugging each other and they were crying, and some of the guys were talking to each other. And I didn't know what they were doing at the time. I just thought they were weirdos. What I realized they were doing now is that they were getting their brain opioid reinforcement in the way that nature intended. So they didn't have to stick a syringe in their arm to get it. That was what they were doing.
Right. So they were feeling their
They were
emotions.
feeling their emotions.
That's what they were doing. They were feeling their emotions and they had the reactions, like
Yeah,
crying.
they were feeling their emotions and they had the mechanisms with which to process those emotions. They developed the skills. The
Right.
key thing is that they turned towards people. They did not turn away from people. The one big difference between me and them is that they turned towards each other.
Yes.
I turned away from all of them. That's the difference. Now, if we take that and we put it on a bigger scale,
Yes.
it's the same thing.
Yeah.
If availability was the key factor, I can tell you from having been on the streets and from being, in all kinds of different situations where, I mean, I don't want to say too much to incriminate myself, but I've seen very large quantities of drugs, things like that.
Hmm.
If it was a question of availability, this crap has been on the streets since year dot. It was there the day I was an addict. It's still there, right? If there is a difference, and if the Sackler family and the Big Pharma are responsible for one thing, I think what they're really responsible for is sort of quasi legitimizing this opioid thing, because what they did effectively was replace the drug dealer from an African American kid with cornrows standing on a street corner with a Glock in his jeans, changing that to a guy wearing a white coat with a gleaming white smile and a prescription pad saying, "So, how many would you like today, sir?" That's what they did, right? Through this quasi legitimizing of the products that we were peddling. But fentanyl was on the streets when I was on the streets. Oxycodone, Oxycontin, all this stuff was on the streets when I was on the streets. They was all there,
Mm-hmm.
and there was no opioid epidemic, right? And it's a very, very simple question. If I'm Mr. John D. Sackler, right, and I'm trying to sell you Oxycontin, yeah, I'm trying to sell Oxycontin, okay?
Yes.
The first thing I need a customer, because without a customer,
Mm-hmm.
you can't sell anything. So my question is, where are all the customers coming from? They weren't there. They weren't there, just a decade and a half ago. I know that for a fact because I was there. I was amongst these people. I was sleeping in bus shelters and things like that. And I know that this stuff was absolutely everywhere. It was rife, but people were not doing what they're doing now.
Right.
So the customers were not there 15 years ago. They are there now. The question is, where have they come from? And why are they there?
Mm-hmm. And so the pharmaceutical companies, they have not fueled this opiate epidemic, if I'm understanding you correctly.
Well, they didn't cause it in the sense that it's like saying sugar causes diabetes. If sugar caused diabetes, then anyone who ate anything with sugar in it would get diabetes. You know, it's you've got to be careful with your terms.
Yeah.
You can say that excessive sugar consumption is a very high risk factor for developing diabetes, right? So, in the same way,
Yes.
you know, um, big pharma didn't cause the opioid epidemic. They didn't create the
Mm-hmm.
customers, But when the customers were there, they sold to the customers. But the question is not who sold to the customer, whether it was, the gangbangers or whether it was the Sackler family. To me, it's an irrelevance. To me, it's the customers and where they came from. That's the real mystery. That's the real, well, it's not a mystery, but it's the real question. Where did the customers come from? Because if there were no customers, Sackler and his cronies could have, danced for their supper. For all I care, they wouldn't have made a dime because there just wouldn't have been any customers. Now, did they exacerbate the problem? Absolutely, right? They saw an opportunity. They realized there's this massive market out there for it. We don't know where the hell it's come from, but it's there. So let's exploit it. And exploit it they did. And they exploited it in very sophisticated ways, publishing papers, that were just patently false, on the level of the papers published by the cigarette companies in the 50s that said smoking didn't cause lung cancer. I mean, I list a series of questions in my book. Did they act in an unethical manner? Yes.
Yes.
Did they exploit the situation to their advantage? Yes. Did they engage in devious and really horrific behavior? Yes. It's yes to all of these things. But did they cause the epidemic? To cause the epidemic means you have to be the one that produces the customer. And they didn't produce the customers. So they didn't cause the epidemic. They made it a hell of a lot worse, and they made it spread much further and much wider than it otherwise might have done. But there was going to be an opioid crisis anyway because of what was happening in society at the time.
Yeah. So I love how you ask and answer all of these questions in your book, which will make for a very interesting read. So let's turn to your book, Dr. Reshie. In fact, let's talk about your Amazon bestseller called A Beginner's Guide to Trauma. What are the...
For 24 hours.
What are the main takeaways for the reader from your book?
Well, I end the book with a quotation from, I think it's Horace, and it goes like this: mutato nomine dite fabuta narrator, which translates as change the name and this story is yours. That's the message that I would give to the people reading the book. Change only the name and this story is yours.
Any last words of wisdom and advice for the listeners?
Well, I wouldn't presume to ever give anyone any advice, but what I would say is that if you are that person, the book starts with a woman who is standing at the end of a pier with concrete blocks tied to her ankle. It's another scene in a book with a guy with a whiskey bottle in his hand and sleeping pill. If you're that person who has reached the end of the road, I mean, for the woman, it literally was the end of the road. She was at the end of a pier going into Lake Michigan, and she had concrete blocks tied to her ankles. So figuratively, metaphorically, and literally, it was the end of the road. If you are a person in that position, that desperation could be your greatest gift. If you simply pick up the phone and call someone and get the help that you need.
Thank you, Dr. Reshie. That is great advice. And I think we can all benefit from just reaching out to someone and know that we will not be met with judgment and shame, because you even said, had you done that, your family would have been there and they would have moved heaven and earth to help you. And I think that's such an important message. We can be met with compassion and kindness, like you've shared in your story, by total strangers who will come alongside us. And so, yes, thank you very much. I think that is important message for the listeners. It's
Yeah.
been wonderful having you, Dr. Reshie. Thank you so much for joining me. I would love to have you back on the podcast because there's still so much to unpack. Where can we find your book?
You can find it at very fine Amazon.com stores everywhere, including one near you. It's that old saying, available at fine bookstores everywhere. So I like to say, available at fine Amazon.com bookstores everywhere. They're in all the major countries I'm aware of, the whole of Europe, Australia, America, this part of the world. Nobody should have any trouble getting hold of one. If you have trouble getting hold of a print copy, it may be because they have run out of a print cycle or something like that has happened, because I've had many messages. My PA has just had so many messages sent to her saying, where's the print edition? It says print edition not available.
Right.
And then 2 hours later, print edition is back up again. They're pretty quick on it, right? So if it's the print edition that you want and it says unavailable, give it a bit of time, log out, log back in again, and or contact us. My website's very easy to remember. It's livingfree.today. That's what it is. The number to my PA is on there, and she'll give you all the links you need to be able to get. There are some places where it's easier to get than others. I think because more people use the Kindle than use the printed version.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, we've noticed that in the UK, nobody's had any trouble getting hold of a printed version because a lot of people use the Kindle. Whereas in Australia, oh my God, that place just, it's one sellout after another, so we're just getting getting people shouting at us every 2 hours, where's my damned book? But it's what we would in the fellowship call a quality problem to have, So yeah.
No, it's a good problem to have, Dr. Reshie.
Absolutely.
And thank you once again for joining me. Thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing so selflessly with the listeners and with me. And we wish you all the best with what lies ahead and your practice and your book. Take care.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure to be here, and thank you for having me on.
Bye.
Bye.
That wraps up this podcast episode. Thank you for listening. If you enjoy my podcast, please take a minute to give me a rating and review in Apple Podcasts. Please subscribe in your favorite podcast directory so you don't miss an episode. Please consider following my Centered Life on Facebook and Instagram for daily inspiration. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. You can catch me again in the next episode. Same time, same place. Sending you lots of love and light.